Hello, everyone, and welcome to Neurocracy. Today, we're joined by Dr. Green, who is a professor and distinguished scholar of neuroscience at University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center. Her lab studies the molecular mechanism of the mammalian circadian clock and how it controls rhythmic physiology, as well as studying the general role of the circadian clock in aging and metabolism. Dr. Green is a member of the editorial board for the Journal of Biological Rhythms and served as the president of the Society for Research on Biological Rhythms from 2016 to 2018. Dr. Green, for my first question, how do you define a circadian rhythm and why does it matter beyond sleep?
Yeah, so it turns out that circadian rhythms really are endogenous timekeeping mechanisms that are present within cells. They are really like little clocks built out of proteins and genes that are within pretty much every cell in your body. And they are important for more than sleep because it turns out that they control almost everything that's going on in your body, from different gene expression patterns, different hormone secretion, your metabolism, the way you store fat, or the way you use glucose or secrete insulin, the way really your mood, your cognitive abilities, all of these things are under the direct control of the circadian clock.
Okay, so if you had to give a TED Talk to high schoolers with just one slide and one piece of info, what would you tell them?
I would just tell them that basically we think that circadian clocks evolved on this earth as an adaptive mechanism so that cells in people, but also in animals, in plants and fungi, could really anticipate the really regular 24-hour pattern that they're exposed to every day and optimize physiology, behavior, everything to match that to really make life work better.
Yeah. So one of the most marked things about adolescence with circadian rhythms is that there's a 2 hour shift in
Hmm.
sleep delay, right? So
Hmm.
I wanted to ask, do you think there's an evolutionary reason for this, or why do you think that there is a 2 hour shift?
Yeah, that's a great question. I really don't know, but it's
Okay.
so well documented that
Yeah,
this
yeah,
happens.
yeah,
Um, Originally back, millions of years ago or thousands of years ago, I guess, maybe there was some adaptive thing where, it helped with metabolism and the changing body during growth or whatever.
yeah.
But I actually have no idea why that would be adaptive. But it's very clear that that is a pretty universal phenomenon. So there must be some reason.
Yeah. So, given that we're on the topic of metabolism, you've previously discussed how the timing of meals can affect our circadian clocks and
Hmm.
overall health. And as a
Right.
high school student at my high school, sometimes my lunch goes from 10:45 or it starts at 12, and this could be on Monday, Tuesday, just switching every single day. So, I wanted
Hmm.
to ask, how significant is this kind of variability for circadian health?
Yeah, we think it's really detrimental.
Yeah.
What we know in animal studies, at least, is if you confine food to different times of day, that has a huge impact on the circadian clock in your various tissues. And I think one of the problems is, um, well, let me rephrase it a little different way.
Okay.
So, food is a very strong, what we call entraining agent on peripheral clocks. And what we mean by that is that the timing of meals can reset the clock. Now, the problem is that that happens in your peripheral tissues, places like muscle and the liver, but it's not a very strong entraining agent to your brain. And so what happens is if you're eating meals at irregular times, your brain thinks it's one time and your body thinks it's another time. And this causes great problems because you're essentially have internal desynchrony, which it causes people a lot of grief. And it's one of the things that happens, for example, in jet lag, when people go overseas, the new light cycle allows their brain to reset pretty quickly within a couple days. But the feeding and the peripheral organs don't reset that quickly. And, it causes gastrointestinal problems, other metabolic problems, insulin problems. So this irregular feeding is basically telling your internal organs, it's this time. No, it's this time. No, it's this time. And so you can imagine that all kinds of metabolic parameters, metabolic pathways are going to get kind of out of whack with each other.
Right. So we've talked about kind of we've touched on school start times and we're talking about meal
Mhm.
times. And from your leadership and advocacy, especially with organizations, what do you see are the biggest obstacles to translating circadian science into societal change?
I think the biggest obstacle is that it's really inconvenient for people to think about it. Um, you know, for example, rather than talk initially about societal changes, let me talk a little bit about chronomedicine.
Okay.
So I think it's a great example. It's maybe a little easier to think about. So, we know from studies in our field that many diseases have rhythmic components to them, whether it's cancer, whether it's infectious disease. And we know that many drugs have circadian effects. And what I mean by that is that they are more efficacious at certain times of day than others. And so this, for example, chemotherapeutics that you take if you are having cancer, we know that many of them are much more effective if given at a certain time of day. You can give the higher doses, there's lower side effects, it's more efficient at killing the cancer cells um, than if you give them in the wrong time of day, where they're less efficient, higher side effects, and so on. And yet, trying to get doctors in the clinic to do this at the appropriate time of day is a terrible fight because their whole clinics are set up with their staffing. It's very inconvenient to try to schedule patients to match the appropriate time of day. And they're just very resistant to the whole idea of it. And I think it's a lot of it is just the inconvenience. Now, when you come to societal problems, I think the same things apply, whether you're talking about school start time, where, there's a bus schedule and there's not enough buses to all go at the same time. And you have drivers that have schedules and
Yeah.
parents that work in different schedules. Um, with regard to school lunchtime, I'm sure it's cafeteria space and how many students they have to cycle through the cafeteria each day. So there's just, I think, kind of institutional and societal pressure that's been built up mostly for, kind of logical, convenient reasons,
Yeah.
but without a lot of thought as to what's happening with the underlying biology.
So, you mentioned earlier, like hospitals having difficulty like scheduling patients at specific times. So,
Mhm.
would you say if they know information that suggests certain times of day are better, would you say that starts to become an ethical issue where they're almost knowing the information yet choosing to ignore it to almost facilitate their institutional scheduling?
Yeah,
Or
I mean, I personally, I do feel that way. I
yeah,
think what they would say is, oh, the effects are small. We've always been doing it this way. I think that they are not probably paying enough attention to how strong the effects are.
yeah,
And so they're kind of dismissing it um, from lack of knowledge and maybe, I don't want to say not wanting to know, but just, it's not like this person's going to die, you know, tomorrow if we don't do this at the right time. It's more like, a broader effect. That maybe they don't buy it or maybe they are just ignorant about how strong the data are. I don't know. Education, I'm sure, is part of it.
right,
Maybe they don't really understand. It's not taught maybe, well enough in medical school how strong these effects are. So I think there's a lot of things that play into it.
yeah.
I don't think doctors are gonna, ever really try to not treat their patients in the best way. I think it's just that there's so many hurdles to overcome. They have to be super convinced, you know.
Sometimes when I try to think about it, I picture if it were like a high profile patient, I feel like they'd be doing everything possible to make them better. So like they would
Hmm.
obviously be considering these times,
Hmm.
but when it comes to, everyday patients, I feel like
Hmm.
sometimes it starts to get a little tricky there.
Hmm.
So continuing from this question, do you think in the next 5 to 10 years there might be a change in how they consider this sort of chrono information?
I think so. It's happening already, it's slow. And I think from the point of view of those of us that have worked in this area for a while, it's slow. We've known a lot of this stuff for a long time,
Right.
but we are starting to see changes. We are starting to see physicians take this into account. We're starting to see pharmacological companies that are designing, for example, time release medicines that,
Yeah.
maybe will allow medicines to be taken in a more convenient way, but still have circadian effects. It's coming. I really think it's coming. And the more publications out there, on how strong these effects are. The more this gets into the medical school curriculum,
Yeah.
um, I think it's going to happen.
So speaking of medical schools, if you could wave a magic wand and change two things about UT Southwestern's medical school to modify it based on the latest circadian and sleep research, what are two changes you'd make?
To the medical students, you mean, for
Sure.
medical
Yeah. Yeah.
training?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Obviously, I think they should learn more about the circadian clock, and I think there's very limited information right now. But I also think, and this is not a criticism of UT Southwestern particularly, it's a more criticism of medical school curriculum overall, and that is it's so memory based and information overload. And, I think it's required. I don't know how you get away from that because these doctors have to know a lot.
Yeah.
But sometimes what's lost is the conceptual ideas or the underlying research that went into generating this information they're learning. And I don't know how you overcome this problem because really they have so much information to learn that it just gets crammed in and they don't have time to really think about these underlying research and concepts that have gone into generating this information. Um, you'd have to add another year on to medical school or something probably to get that incorporated, and nobody's going to want to do that. But, I see that as yeah, I see that as something that would really make our doctors better is if they had a little bit more of that.
Yeah. So I know you've touched on the training and like the curriculum and what you would want to add to it. Is there anything about the campus that you would change? Like maybe meal times, the lighting? Yeah.
Aha.
I've heard
Um,
some pretty interesting ideas from other people, so I'm curious what you have. Yeah. Yeah.
I think actually that our campus is pretty good.
Okay. That's good.
Again, I'm not a medical doctor, so I'm not always in the clinics very often,
Right.
so I don't know, I can't really speak to that. Certainly on the research side of things, we have very nice buildings with very big windows, so we're very exposed to daily light cycles. The uh, access to food, the access to exercise is really part of our culture here. But look, we have walking trails and a lot of nice gardens outside, and I feel like the work schedules are pretty good, and keep us kind of aligned. We all work too long, probably, and but I think they do a pretty good job here, honestly, at least on the basic research side of things, of really, helping people maintain happy and healthy lives as far as their circadian clocks go.
Yeah. So is there any specific habit that you personally try to maintain to keep your circadian rhythms on track that you'd like to share?
Right. So two things I would say, maybe, well, three things
Okay.
maybe. Sleep is one of the most critical things.
Yeah.
I try to always get a good night's sleep, and I try to keep that sleep time very regular, even on the
Yeah.
weekends. So I don't stay up super late on the weekends and wake up late. I try
Yeah.
to keep to my normal schedule. Um, I eat at regular times, as we were talking about, and then try
Yeah.
to keep my eating window pretty much within 12 hours, kind of aligned with daylight. So I don't eat late at night unless I can absolutely not avoid it.
Okay.
I think that's really important. And then I exercise very regularly and typically at the same time of day, which I think exercise and activity is obviously healthy for you in general, but it's also very healthy for your circadian clock. It also helps to entrain the circadian clock in your cells and keep you very aligned with your local environment. So
Yeah.
those are really my three things.
Okay. I know a lot of people try to exercise around 5, and I believe is that when body temperature is around it like makes like a peak there.
Right.
Want to like
Yeah.
touch on that maybe?
Yeah. There's,
Is
and
that
there's different schools of thought.
right?
A lot of people exercise in the evening, and there's been some, literature suggesting that you are at peak performance for certain types of exercise then. There's also a school of thought that says exercise in the morning.
Yeah.
And I think it depends a lot on your individual body, on what types of exercises you do. But I think the regularity of it is
Okay.
probably one of
Yeah.
the really important
Yeah.
things.
So looking ahead, what excites you the most about where research on circadian rhythms is going?
For me personally, there's been a big push in the last few years, maybe last 15 years or so, on really the translational aspect of taking the information we've learned about circadian clocks at the very basic level and really translating that to clinic and patients and how to help with various diseases and your aging, for example, and long, healthy lifespans. And I find all that very exciting. But the other side of that is that we now have the tools and techniques that we didn't have, 10 years ago that allow us to understand how the clock works at the molecular level in so much more detail than we
Oh
ever
yeah.
could. And I'm trained as a biochemist, molecular biologist, so
Yeah.
being able now essentially to look in at this clock and see things about the way it works that we could not even fathom understanding, 10 years ago is super exciting to me. And it's allowing us also to design better drugs that can modulate the circadian clock, perhaps, because we can actually look at the binding of the proteins and where the drug might bind and, how we might affect the clock in different ways. And so all of that very hardcore biochemical molecular stuff is
Yeah.
what I'm super excited about right now. And I think that's going to ultimately help with the translatability of the clock.
Yeah, so in the lab that I worked in, we actually used luciferin from fireflies
Hmm.
to create a fusion.
Hmm.
Right? Is that common technique?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah,
I
it's a
remember
pretty
thinking,
common technique.
yeah.
My close collaborator here is two of them actually were what some of the labs that started using that technique
Oh,
originally.
wow.
Yeah, and it
That's
just
awesome.
allows you to
Yeah.
really watch the clock in real time,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and that's so
Yeah, we had
cool.
like the PMT,
Hmm.
and we'd use like trash bags to like cover them, take out all the
Right.
background light. Super cool stuff.
Yeah, it's
So,
very neat.
yeah. Do you know of any other like super cool imaging techniques maybe or
Oh
research
yeah,
that's
so
going on?
lately people have really gotten into instead of using the luciferase, which is great for monitoring rhythms overall,
Right.
we now have so many ways of labeling individual proteins with fluorescent markers,
Okay.
and with those you can get not just a general light output, counting the amount of light, but you can actually look at the where the protein is going within the cell. You can
Uh,
watch the protein move in and out of the nucleus or
wow.
whatever over the
Yeah.
circadian day and get together with other proteins and go places. And,
Nice.
it's
Yeah.
the cool imaging, super high resolution imaging that now allows us to really see what those proteins are doing is just amazing.
Yeah. It's amazing how the field is constantly advancing. We never know what'll be going on next like 20, 10, 20 years.
And so
Exciting.
much of it is pushed by technology development,
Yeah.
because we have all these ideas and questions, but a lot of the questions are hard to answer if you are limited by the techniques that you have.
Yeah.
And as people develop new ways of doing things, it opens up whole new, windows of opportunity.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time, Dr.
Of
Green. It was
course.
great to hear your insights, and I'm glad we got to reflect on some of the obstacles and what's going on in the future. And it was a pleasure having you on.
Pleasure for me as well. Thank you so much and good
Thank you.
luck.
Yeah.